Chris Bramah, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's an honour to have you.
No, thank you very much. Been a massive fan of your podcast for a long time. You've had some fantastic guests on this show, so it's really nice to be here.
What a beautiful thing to say. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a quick intro? And I'm absolutely delighted to get you on because I think the topic that we're going to dive into is so relevant for now because of the work that you've done and people around you have done. So really, really excited to get you on. But yeah, back to the intro. Little intro from you.
Yeah, who am I? Question that I struggle with on a daily basis. Ryan, no. So joking aside, I'm a physio by background. My PhD is in biomechanics, and I guess I currently work at two main places really. So I work at the University of Salford, where I lecture on the physiotherapy program there. Also a researcher, with my research focusing on sports injuries, sports injury biomechanics. So we have like a couple of different PhD students and projects that we've got ongoing in various different areas. And then I still work applied. I like to practice what I preach, so to speak. So I work over at the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance, where I have a couple of different roles there really. One of them is as a physio, where I work with mainly track and field athletes, or mainly track athletes to be fair. And that can be like a mix. So I get a mix of chronic injuries and long-term rehabilitation patients. And then there's also athletes that I just work as part of their day-to-day team in the like prep and build up to whatever major champs that we've got coming up. So obviously we've got the Olympics this year, got quite a few athletes that then trying to just stay on top of managing niggles and making sure we don't get injured, things like that. And then one of my other bigger roles at Manchester Institute of Health and Performance, or we generally call it MIP, right? We abbreviate it to MIP. So one of my bigger roles at MIP is delivering biomechanics assessments. So basically we are a facility that is a really integrated sports science centre. We have access to unbelievable amounts of kit, so it's great fun. We get to play with that on a daily basis. But from a biomechanics sense, one of my roles is to deliver 3D biomechanics assessments for different clients. So we'll work with like Premier League football clubs, rugby teams, individual athletes. And we basically try to use motion capture to get like a unique insight into the current function of individuals. We try and help medical teams use that information to inform rehab, to inform return to play decision making. We'll get cases where we're just trying to understand potential contributors to long-term injuries or recurrent injuries. And yeah, that's like the cool thing we get to do with 3D biomechanics there. How I got to this point, I'm going to keep this one really short, but basically two streams to what I've done is clinical stuff and then research stuff. So clinically, I started out in rugby league. Great fun sport to be part of because everyone just smashes each other, gets injured all the time. So as a new physio, that's a steep learning curve and, from a learning perspective. After leaving rugby league, went on to do some private stuff, worked for British Athletics, which has always been my love because track and field is my sport. I absolutely love it. So did that before coming over to MIP and starting at MIP around 2018. And then from a research sense, I actually started messing around with 3D motion capture in 2010. So we're trying to use it for research purposes then, primarily looking at running performance and injuries. And then I started a PhD in 2014. And what we did for the PhD is there was no funding at the time. So we actually took motion capture and started selling it to clients, which is kind of what we do now. But the idea there was like, people could pay in to get the benefits and the information that we gain from biomechanics for their own individual purposes. But at the same time, that income generated funding for research projects, for PhDs, master's degrees. And it also formed like a big data collection process for us. So we sort of rolled with it from there really. I finished my PhD in 2020. So yeah, I guess that's the long, short story to me. Messing around with motion capture since, the last 14 years, I guess.
Sounds good. Thank you for that. So just in terms of the MIP, who owns the MIP? Was this the way I understood it was City, EIS, as it used to be,
Yeah.
And then counsel? Is
Yeah,
that
you're pretty much spot on. So MIP is run by a couple of different parties, City Football Group being one, Manchester Council, Sport England being another. It then has like a healthcare operator who operates the procedures that go on within the building, which you kind of have to have if you're going to do interventions or MRI scans or anything clinical on site. So the building is then set into two halves. You have like the health side and the performance side. Performance side is like sports science. So we have 3D biomechanics, we have environmental chamber, force plates, biodex, pretty much everything you could kind of want. And the ethos of the centre is not only to like deliver for elite sport individuals, but also to provide for the surrounding community and have a positive impact upon the community. So, that's something that I guess I'm really passionate about, is how we integrate what we do on a high performance level and be able to use that information to enhance whoever we work with, like regardless. I think that can be done. I'm pretty passionate about that. And that's, I guess, what the centre is trying to reflect in the way it operates.
My next thing coming from that little intro was your emphasis on practicing what you preach, and as a researcher, and that may seem quite obvious, but then as I've thought about it, when you've said that, maybe it's not so obvious, and there's people out there doing research and guiding, hopefully trying to guide practice in the kind of stuff that they do that maybe don't practice, and not to like take you down a Piers Morgan route versus a Michael Parkinson route, but how important is that for you, and having that practical and clinical experience, ongoing experience? How has that allowed you to do what you've done with what we're going to discuss with the SMAS as well?
Yeah, I mean, early on in my career, I guess, like when I was reflecting on what I want to do or what I want to try and do, I always wanted to try and have as big an impact as I could with my work to others around me. Because I always view, like, if you're going to do something that's impactful, you can do it by influencing one person at a time, or if you try to make those around you also more knowledgeable and learn from what you know, that they can impact the people that they work with too, and have what I call the bigger ripple effect. So for me, when I was thinking, okay, how do you have the biggest ripple effect, I kind of separated what I think we need to do within three main areas that all, I think, interact. So clinical practice, so actually get hands-on with patients, see what works, be able to ask questions from what we need to be doing in an applied sense. Research, so to really just explore those like anecdotal bits of information that you get from case by case patient or your own experiences. Try and back it up and really question it and see if it holds true. So be willing to be wrong, basically. And then education, which is sharing that like knowledge. So I've tried to contribute in each of those three areas because I think they all feed into what I do from a practice sense. So like patients and clinical scenarios will constantly leave me questioning. And actually I find serves as a really good platform for me then to go and develop some of these questions into research. So I think it's really important to have the two, and then to see like how research actually does apply with the patients that we work with. I think that is solidly important. And I think if you only work in one particular area, so if we only work in clinical practice, often we can become a bit blinkered in terms of we do what we do and not really be aware of alternative viewpoints to the way that we can practice and alternative ways of doing things. And then from a research sense, sometimes we get like bogged down in the process and the numbers and can actually forget us to ask the question of whether or not our work is going to impact the people it purports to. And sometimes we can just ask the wrong research questions where, yeah, it might be interesting, but it's not really going to help the people at the end of the day, which I guess is what we want to do. So yeah, for me, it means that I have an absolutely bananas life, which my wife will continually point out to me. But I think everything and each one of those things has a real key place in life. And who knows how long I can keep that going for, though.
No, that sounds good, and that leads to interesting discussions that we're going to have just now. Just be careful of that microphone just on your t-shirt, but we'll be all good. Right, let's get into some of the work you've done recently. So, running mechanics, it's very on topic because people care about speed, people care about injuries, people care about hamstring injuries. So, little trifecta there. Plus, we've got the speed conference coming up, so it's all on topic. So, running mechanics, what do we know about risk factors when it comes to hamstring injuries?
Yeah. So, big question to kick off with. Sprint running mechanics as a risk factor for hamstring injuries. Now, I tend to come at this from two different angles, right? I've got my science hat, and I've got my applied practice hat. So, putting my science hat on, first of all, I think it's important for us to recognize what we mean when we use the term risk factors. Now, with regards to risk factors, we can have causal factors and associative factors. Now, causal factors are those ones where we are confident that a specific variable or the possession of a specific feature will increase the likelihood that somebody will get injured in the future. Now, for something to be deemed a causal risk factor, we need appropriate research designs, which is usually from things like randomized control trials or really well-designed prospective studies. Now, with regards to sprint running mechanics, we actually don't have these designs done. And it's really important to point out that actually that's probably true for most sports injury risk factors. And it's largely because doing those types of studies is insanely difficult to do. And it's specifically for biomechanics, right? If you think sprint running mechanics, it'll take us 2 hours to do an assessment on one player. So to be able to do that on a mass scale for research becomes incredibly difficult. Now, it doesn't mean that sprint running mechanics aren't a factor that should be considered within hamstring injuries, because there is a lot of evidence out there that's coming out and that's emerging that shows that there are associations between possessing certain mechanical features and developing future injury. So we do have an association between the two. And in actual fact, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that we have more evidence that links sprint running mechanics and certain features to hamstring injuries than we do that links change of direction and or deceleration mechanics to ACL injuries. Yet often people are pretty comfortable with saying we need to address change of direction mechanics, less comfortable with sprint. So, I think we need to bear that in mind. Now, if I then go and put my applied practice, my clinical hat on, I'm a true believer that in practice we should really be taking what is the available evidence out there, and we should be using what available information we have to make an informed decision as to whether or not we think a risk factor is relevant for us to consider within our practice. Now, for me to do that, I'm a big believer in that phrase of absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. So when I look at any particular risk factor, which is particularly true for biomechanics, I like to think of two things. My first thing that I like to consider is whether or not we've got biological plausibility that a certain feature could lead to injury. And the second thing is there an evidence of an association between the two? And for sprint running mechanics, yes, we have biological plausibility and links to future injury. Now, this is particularly the case for certain features, which include things like lumbar-pelvic control, the real ambiguous term that is lumbar-pelvic control, overstride running mechanics, and backside running mechanics. So if I delve into lumbar-pelvic control first of all, when taking the ambiguity out of that term, for me, what that is representing is opposing movements of the pelvis and lumbar spine, right? So as the pelvis rotates forward into anterior tilt, we get extension of the lumbar spine. As it drops away from the standing leg, the spine side flexes the other way. So lumbar pelvic control is about how large these angular differences are between the two. And specifically relating to hamstring injuries, we have some really nice studies that show that things like anterior pelvic tilt actually will increase the strain that's applied to the hamstring. So Yurden Mendegucci has got some great work that he recently published that shows for, I think it was I can't remember what the exact numbers, but as you increase anterior pelvic tilt, bigger strain on that proximal aspect of the hamstring, which is where the majority of injuries occur. And then that's combined with like Joe Schumann's work, which has actually shown soccer players who have greater anterior pelvic tilt during swing more likely to get injured in the future. Only small numbers, but basically we've got an association there between the two and plausibility between the two. And it's the same for like other features. So there was some really nice like modeling work that was done years ago that shows by Elizabeth Chumanoff. And they basically modeled the effect of different muscles and looked at how they could impact hamstring stretch. And what they found was that muscles like your adductor magnus, your internal, external obliques, these all have a contribution in reducing the stress or the stretch applied to the hamstring during running. So what that is effectively can be interpreted as is that these muscles contribute to maintaining control of the trunk and the pelvis, or minimizing these angular displacements, which in turn contributes to decreasing the actual total stretch that's applied to the hamstring tissue itself. So if you think like, you know, if we increase the stretch of a muscle, expose it to high force, which is what we do when we run, that would logically lead to strain injuries. So their work is effectively saying that these muscles can decrease that stretch and therefore perhaps minimize the total strain that's applied during running. So those ones are the most like evidenced. I think like overstride, for example, there's not a lot of evidence like to say that that's a strong risk factor for future hamstring injury, but there's definite biological plausibility. So if you look at all the different biomechanical studies, like features of an overstride, so I would book it forward leaning into overstriding. Leg out stretched in front of your body, so foot ahead of center of mass. What that does biomechanically, and it's widely known, is it reduces ankle joint contribution to supporting our body. So the ankle does less, and it increases the demand on the hip extensors for maintaining like forward momentum and vertical propulsion. And not only that, is it'll also like lengthen the hamstrings. So collectively, if you overstride, what you then get is a longer hamstring position, more force demand on the hip extensors. So, you know, for me, if you add the two together, you're obviously going to get more strain on the particular hamstring tissue. So that's biologically plausible. It's just not been necessarily shown, and that to be linked to future injury. And that's largely because we actually just don't have that evidence there that's investigated it. And it's the same for backside running mechanics. Now, if you look at backside running mechanics, Ralph Mann, I think, originally referred to this as like a collection of different features. So like excessive pushing, so the trailing leg really extending behind somebody or left out the back too long. Back kick of that trailing leg as well, where your heel's flicking up and limb movements are occurring more predominantly behind the center of mass rather than in front of the center of mass. So he proposed those type of features as backside running mechanics, and then it kind of makes logical sense that they would increase hamstring tissue strain, because if you think about it, the modeling work shows hip flexors are capable of inducing stretch on the lead leg hamstring. So as your hip flexors contract on your back leg, it creates an angular rotation about the pelvis, which influences stress on that front leg. So if you have greater backside mechanics, so you're leaving the leg out behind you too long, what you're allowing to happen is the legs to get into a bigger separation between the two of them. You're allowing the front leg to start to unfold, so that shins start to extend out, so then hamstrings start to lengthen. And then you're influencing, or you're bringing in the contraction of the hip flexors on the trailing leg, which are going to create this further angular rotation of the pelvis and stretch on that lead hamstring. So basically, backside mechanics get you into big thigh separation angles, big hamstring stretches, and then further add in more to that when the hip flexors contract. So, you know, that it kind of makes sense that these would be features that influence the stress and strain applied to the hamstrings, and therefore logically could over time lead to either a fatigue-related tissue failure or acute tissue failure. So for me, they are a thing, but I think for any practitioner, like, we've got to really be important to, or it is really important to make sure that we don't think that mechanics as a singular factor are the be-all and end-all of every single injury. It's the same for anything, right? Strength, mechanics, exposure, they all need to be considered together, not one of these factors on their own. My joking comment, which is also generally really serious, is that, you know, you can have the worst mechanics in the world or be the weakest player in the world, and you will not get injured if you spend your time warming the bench. So from a clinical standpoint, we've got to consider the interaction between all these factors, not pin too much on one thing, but yes, I would say mechanics are logically going to contribute somewhere down the line to injury. We just need the evidence to start catching up with that theory to try and support it a little bit more.
So good. I'll let you get a little slurp of coffee while or water, while I ask the next question. So is there still people out there who publicly believe that running mechanics, basically all the stuff that you've just said, is not a factor, and it doesn't particularly matter? There's no acceptance.
Yeah, it's like running mechanics definitely seem to polarize people's views, because some of the arguments of what people will say are that tissues should adapt to the specific mechanics that are imposed on them, or that there's no evidence for mechanics leading to injury development, you know, but like I've just highlighted, right, we've got biological plausibility, and we have got some evidence that shows that from prospective studies, that certain mechanical features are related to future injury development. But also, like, here's my clinical interpretation, is that I think a lot of people will shy away from the idea of mechanics being a thing, because I actually don't think a lot of us are confident in, one, how we assess it, and then second, like, once we can assess it, what do we do with that information? So it becomes really easy for us to like just revert back to, okay, well, I'm just going to go back into the gym and just do some more strengthening exercises because that's what I was taught at university and that's what I'm really comfortable with, versus just accept or try to delve into an area that people might not necessarily be as comfortable with.
Which leads delightfully into ways to assess running mechanics. So we'll go into the SMAS in a minute, but what are the current pre-SMAS? What options have we got?
Okay. So assessing running mechanics, and there are actually not very many options out there. So we've got the gold standard, which is 3D biomechanics and 3D motion capture. That's what I tend to spend a lot of my days working with and playing with. The challenge that you have with 3D motion capture is it gives us really nice and in-depth information for an individual and for their function, but it's really time consuming to use. So like I mentioned earlier, it'll take us at least 2 hours. We're pretty swift with assessments, and it can take us 2 hours to assess an individual person. And then when you're processing that data and you're trying to like pull off certain numbers and look at certain things, that can take even longer. So yes, it's gold standard, but the simple fact is, other than complex cases, it's very difficult to integrate it on like on a wide scale. So if you don't have 3D biomechanics, what people have generally resorted to is either their own coach's eye in the field, or 2D motion capture using slow motion videos. So 2D motion capture does give you some degree of reliability and is a useful thing to use and to do. It's again pretty time consuming. And then in terms of other methods, so coach's eye or even app-based methods, they really kind of lack the level of reliability or validity that you want from an assessment method. I mean, definitely the way to go. AI is definitely the way to go in the future, but currently it's just not we don't really know if it's reliable or valid.
Is there anything out? Sorry to interrupt, Chris. Is there anything out there currently in the research about computer vision and AI in terms of running mechanics?
Well, a lot of the motion capture companies that specialize in 3D, so Qualisys being one, they're investing quite heavily into the development of markerless technology. But for me, like, and there's a lot of work that's coming out to show its validity and its reliability. So these systems are still camera based. They're just a lot cheaper and easier to integrate in like applied settings. But with regards to like mobile phone and app based technology, There are some companies that are trying to do it. I think Scott Selby is a biomechanist behind one company in America that are trying to do something. However, like, for me, I kind of sit and think, if Qualisys is like a huge company that have invested absolute millions into their technology, and they're still resorting to camera-based motion capture, and then I'm a bit like, well, we've probably got a long way to go when it comes to video methods. But look, that's what we need. We do need it to go that way. Just I'm a bit like of a stickler when it comes to the science aspect. I like to know my methods are reliable. I like to know that I'm getting the best information. Particularly like if you're going to bring me a football player who's worth, I don't know, £100 million and say, okay, is that person ready to go back onto the pitch following an injury, or are there any deficits there? And my reliability is all over the place, so my answer's just a guess. So I'd kind of like to know that the methods I'm using are backing up the information that I'm going to give somebody.
Makes sense. So the answer to my next question is pretty clear. So why do we need another solution? And I'll leave that to you to introduce the SMAS.
Okay, so other solutions are kind of why I came up with the sprint mechanics assessment score. And that was primarily because one club at the time that we were working with turned around to me and they said, I think their words were, look, we love sending individual players for assessments, and I'd love to send the entire squad, but putting them all on a bus and driving them to Manchester is just not realistic. So can you come up with something we can use in field? Now, at the time, they asked that question around a different injury. I just nicely went away and thought that actually I think this kind of applies to hamstring injuries instead. So we basically tried to come up with a simplified method of assessing mechanics in practice that practitioners can use, that's quick, that's reliable, and that can hopefully build their confidence in what people are seeing. So at present, if you rely just on the coach's eye, for many practitioners, particularly novice practitioners who are new to looking at movement, they might not have a clue what to look for or at all, or how to structure their assessment. So in that instance, the sprint mechanics assessment score we developed to try and give people a bit more confidence, for one. Second of all, I sometimes would get a little bit annoyed when clinicians would fixate too much on singular variables that might actually not even matter, so even lack biological plausibility. So the idea of the sprint mechanics assessment score was to, I'm going to coin a phrase that Lee Harrington would always use with me, which is, if it walks like a duck and it sounds like a duck and it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So the sprint mechanics assessment score,
I love that.
Is
I love that. It's class.
Yeah. Well, that's effectively what we tried to go with the using the sprint mechanics assessment score. So it's a 12-item scoring tool, right? And for each criteria has a mechanistic link to influencing hamstring tissue strain. And then the idea is, the more points you get, the more confident you can be as a practitioner that what you're seeing is a duck, or actually more obviously put, is somebody who doesn't run very well, and their mechanics might be something worth considering. So it's trying to go from, look, let's not focus too much on a singular feature that might mean nothing, and let's instead kind of build our confidence with what we're seeing in the mechanics assessment process is somebody who can't move well, and therefore we might need to act a bit differently in terms of how we manage the people. So it's dead simple, easy assessment to use. Literally, we can screen entire squads within 7 minutes. We just, at the end of a warm-up, get them rolling through sprints across a 30-meter flat-out sprint with the camera positioned on a tripod next to them. So most clubs that we've done it with are pretty much like, oh yeah, that actually did not interrupt our training at all, and are quite happy to keep using it. Now, it's not infallible, don't get me wrong, it's not going to replace 3D motion capture, but as I say, it's there to help practitioners start to build confidence in whether or not mechanics might be a problem and give them a way to assess things reliably.
So give us an idea of the setup, like where's the camera, how are people capturing the data before we get into the analysis piece?
Yep, so we set up a 30-meter runway. I tend to put timing gates out at the same time. the camera then I position between, so it's perpendicular to the center of the 25 to 30 meter mark, and it's at least 7.5 meters away. So it needs to be like far enough back that you don't get a parallax error. So a parallax error is where if you're too close and you look at people from an angle, you'll misconceive what the joint angles look like. It perceptually will look a bit different. So you need to be far enough back to avoid that. But if you're too far back, you can't see the person. So we found 7.5 meters is probably about right for that. Then we make sure you capture in the move at max velocity between the 25 to 30 meter mark to avoid people just slowing down or breaking through the capture volume or dipping on the line, which just ruins the data collection. I would generally set it up to make them run to 35 meters. And I put a timing gate at 35 meters that I don't have turned on, just to cue them to just keep running straight through. So yeah, and then it's set up 30 meters at the side, 7.5 meters away, usually about 0.9 meters in terms of height on a tripod. Hit the record button, slow motion, and get people just rolling through, players rolling through, walking back.
And what kind of camera? Any spec of camera?
Well, yeah, well, to be honest, we just use the iPhone, and the reason being is because actually the sampling rate is ridiculously good. It samples at 240 frames a second and give you really high quality, so it still gives you 1080p definition. But in general, you could probably get like a Panasonic camera that will sample at around 100 frames per second at still about 720p resolution. But iPhones and slow motion cameras now, they have come on so much, I think they're better than most digital cameras.
So talk us through each point of the SMAS and why. I know you've dived into why a little bit, why each one may have been chosen, but is there anything that you haven't covered, and you can take us through that scoring system, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so it's 12 items. To come up with the 12 items, we've tried to be really structured in this process. So we actually started by Rudy Kalema's work was a real great starting point for this, because he published a concept mapping study where he looked at coach and practitioner opinion of what mechanics are important in hamstring strain injuries. So Rudy knows this. Like, we took his work and basically took all of those parameters that coaches and practitioners think are important. We then did a lit review where we looked at, okay, what has a biological plausibility in influencing tissue stress via published studies, and what has evidence of an association to future injury development via published studies. So we published that lit review. That was with JB and Jordan and Tom Dos Santos. And that was then us going, right, well, what mechanics do people think are important? What mechanics are proven to be important? And then that next phase was like getting sort of coach and practitioner feedback on, okay, how do we look at these parameters, and is there any that we've missed? So, you know, some people might think that there are other things that would be of interest to look at there, but reason for things not being included in is probably because you can't reliably assess them, or they're not plausible in terms of how they'd influence tissue stress. So things like tibial rotation and rotation of the shin. I get it. I do understand why you might want to look at that, but we can't reliably do that, and it makes it more complex, and we've got no evidence to say actually it's influencing injury risk. So we kind of excluded it, but I do understand it. So the parameters that we left with and the features, I generally separate them into the three categories I mentioned before, which are lumbar-pelvic control features of anterior pelvic tilt, excessive trunk rotation, and we look at these during the swing phase primarily. We also look at anterior pelvic tilt on stance phase as well. Then there's the features of backside mechanics, which we've separated into excessive extension of the trailing limb. So it's characteristic of somebody who, I guess you could say, is over pushing at that terminal stance phase, so just as the toe is about to leave the ground. Back kicking of the trailing limb. So once they get to mid-swing point, whether or not that heel is excessively lifting up above the knee height. Thigh separation angle, so the gap between the thighs at terminal swing and during stance phase. And then we've got overstride type features, which include whether or not the foot is excessively in front of the center of mass, whether or not the shin is extended. So this is a simple one to visualize. It's kind of like, well, if you look at the ankle malleoli, is that ahead of the knee joint when they touch down. Really simple to see. So that's your shin position. Trunk forward lean is another one. And then once they transition into mid stance is whether or not they just sink excessively vertically, so vertical collapse. Now we tend to break it into the different phases of the gait cycle because these are the phases where force demands are highest on the hamstrings. So that being swing phase and then again during stance phase. And also the use of the collective mechanics really should reflect the fact that mechanics have an interdependency upon one another. So what I mean by that is each individual parameter is going to influence what happens next in your gait cycle. So for example, if you overstride, so that foot's ahead of the center of mass, you are most likely going to have to sink and flex through the knee during stance to keep your center of mass moving forward. So overstride and vertical collapse seem to mix. And then if you're to maintain forward momentum, you've got to then push excessively to re-accelerate your mass going forward, which often leads to excessive trailing limb extension. And then with the trailing limb being excessively behind you, that's now starting to bring in backside mechanics. So as you get into swing phase, that leg's going to kick up. So you've got more back kick. Then as you get to terminal swing, you're going to have bigger thigh separation angles. And because you then can't snap the legs and scissor the legs through at that late swing phase, that front foot starts to contact the ground a bit too early, and now you've got an overstride again. So the fact of the thing of the score and all of these different parameters is also trying to reflect the fact that no one biomechanical parameter is likely to occur in isolation. And if you look at the whole picture, you become a little bit more confident that, okay, this person is actually running pretty badly versus going, oh, I think that they've just got a 1 degree excessive thigh separation angle and that's the problem. It's like, no, is it blatantly a problem or not? That's the idea of the score.
And each of the scores, is it like on a scale? How is it?
No. So it's really simple, right? So to plug the work and increase my own metrics for reads on the article, it's open access if you Google Sprint Mechanics Assessment Score. But basically, the score is on there and it's a simple yes or no criteria. So we've got clear descriptors of what you're looking for at each phase so that, to make it as reliable as possible. So to give you thigh separation angle as an example, when someone gets that terminal swing phase, so it's the point where the knee is the most extended during the swing phase on the front leg, the simple question to ask yourself is the knee of the trailing leg located behind the glute? So if the knee of the trailing leg's behind the glute at that point in time, that's classed as yes, they have a large thigh separation angle. They get 1 point. And this process you go through for each of the individual parameters, it builds this overall score then out of 12 points. If somebody has 12 points, you're pretty confident that they don't move very well when they run. If somebody has 0 points, you're pretty confident that they do move pretty well. What we did with that is we've got a pretty large data set of professional footballers that went through, and we basically used that data set of all these footballers to identify what you could class as normative values, I guess. So based on the distribution of the data and the means of the data, we've kind of separated it as if you've got the average point is 4. So from 4 to 5, you'd say is probably average. 0 to 1 is excellent. And then if you're getting 6 or above, we sort of classify that as poor mechanics, really. So it's simple to use and you can read it through that. But Carlos has also incorporated it into his MyJump lab, which people might have come across. So that makes it really easy for you to use because on the MyJump lab, you can literally record somebody run past and then it'll go through the criteria and ask you the questions for each of the frames anyway, and give you the overall score. So he's made it really nice and easy for people to do.
So does that pick out the frames and you just move through them and assess them, or are you manually picking out the frames?
No, you still have to manually pick out the frames. Okay. You record them and then you sort of tab through, and then you sort of stop it at that individual frame. And what it'll then just do is it'll tell you the frame. So it'll come up and say toe off. You tab it through to toe off. and it'll then ask you the question as well as to whether or not they have that, and it'll create you like nice kinogram at the end of it, as well as give you the overall score. So he has done a really good job, and he turned that around really quick. So I've got to thank JB Morin for putting us both in touch on that, because he's done a fantastic job with it.
Carlos is an absolute legend on so many fronts.
Mate, he did that. He literally did that over the Easter weekend. I'm eating chocolate eggs and he's like coding on a computer.
I was going to say, did you publish that and then give it to him, or was he involved in the process and he did it as you go? But you've just answered that question. You published it and then he turned it around pretty quick.
Yeah, I published it. He saw it, and I think, I don't know if he saw it first or JB pointed it out to him, and then obviously JB put us both in touch. And literally, I think it was the Friday, I was like, yeah, this would be great. On the Sunday evening, I'm eating a chocolate egg, like filming videos of my dog and kinogramming my dog on his beta version. And then on the Monday, he's like put it on social media that it's out for everybody.
Wowza.
So he was fantastic.
There's a reason why Apple are shipping him out to the US to their events, because the guy's a genius. So potential mistakes from your learnings as you've gone on, from watching other people do it, from feedback, what are potential mistakes in that whole process from data collection to analysis that people can attack up front and make sure they don't do?
Okay, potential mistakes within that, right? I think the biggest mistake that I've probably got to put out there from a scientific standpoint is overly fixating on mechanics or misusing the interpretation of mechanics for a clinical purpose. As a clinician, right, I think you've got to have your big rocks first of all. And there are certain things that if you're working with a hamstring strain injury that you really want to consider and assess, which are going to be your obvious ones, like your tissue qualities, your physical capacities, your training load exposure, as well as your running mechanics. So I just think a big mistake is if people fixate on all I now need to do from an injury prevention, screening and rehabilitation standpoint is to just look at mechanics. That's just complete fallacy. So consider it within that multifactorial concept is number one. The other mistakes then are like literally not standardizing how you set up the camera or taking into it any form of bias into your like view of assessing mechanics. Sometimes we will see what we want to see. So if you bring in bias when you assess those mechanical features, it might be quite easy for you to go, oh yes, they have this, they definitely must move bad. So you've really got to try and remove that. We did remove that in the research process because Tom DeSantos had no idea about any single one of these players and had to score every single video, which he'll probably forever curse me on. But yeah, like remove bias, make sure the setup is the same that you have every single time, and use my trick of like literally make people sprint to 35 meters or 40 meters so that they don't decelerate or slow down. And if they do, exclude it. And if they're not within that specific frame of that 5 to 25 to 30 meters, don't look at the pictures that are outside of that, because that will give you parallax error. So look central, make sure people run through. They're the big mistakes, really.
So when it comes to interpretation, like you can get fantastic data that you've not done the things you've just mentioned to make sure you've got the really good data. You've stuck it through Carlos's app, of course. Where are we going with that now? How are we using that to actually intervene and make sure these guys don't get hammy injuries?
Yeah, so intervention is a really important one, because I think the concept of mechanics and how we intervene is often what polarizes viewpoints on whether or not mechanics is a consideration, like at all. So often this comes from arguments where people will say, okay, we can't change mechanics, or we shouldn't change mechanics, and therefore we'll disregard mechanics completely. Now, I don't think we should be disregarding them, full stop. And I think like even if you don't want to make a change, you don't have to, but mechanics will influence the loading environment that is applied to tissues. And if you can understand that loading environment, you can inform your rehabilitation or your conditioning strategies to be more specific for how you manage that individual or condition that individual. So let me take like the Nordic as a specific example here, right? Some of those early research papers that were published on the Nordic as a preventative or a rehabilitation technique actually say that the idea behind it was that we are going to provide an eccentric load to condition the hamstrings to cope with the biomechanical demand of decelerating the shank as it swings out in front of you during swing phase. So the Nordic as an intervention is trying to condition the tissue for those biomechanical demands. So if we know that certain mechanical features will also change the demands on a tissue, why are we not conditioning the hamstring to deal with that? So let's take overstride as a specific example. If somebody overstrides, it increases the total work done by the hip extensors during the stance phase. So there is more demand on the hip extensors, and in particular the hamstrings, to keep pushing us forward. They're also being loaded in a longer length, and they've got greater peak forces during the stance phase because the joint moments at the hip extensors will go up. So for me then, if somebody overstrides and I don't want to change the mechanics, I just need to accept that from a loading environment, I now need that hamstring to cope with greater work at longer levers and greater peak force during that early phase. So for me, I then take that into my conditioning strategies and think, right, well, okay, I've really got to build tissue capacity in this area. So tissue endurance, first of all, to cope with greater work done. I've really got to build isometric and concentric peak force on a small in the angle and hip flex position, so long lever position, to be able to overcome the ground reaction forces as I hit the ground to begin with. So that automatic, and to be fair, because it's during stance phase and overstride, the hamstrings are going to function ideally isometric, concentric. So I've got to make sure that they can deal with that manner. So automatically now I can change your conditioning strategies to better prepare you to deal with the highest stress that you cope with because of your mechanics. Now, what often we do as practitioners is we'll have our little things, our normative values that we want people to hit, be that for Nordboard, be that for a single leg bridge. We'll have normative values that are based on team and population norm numbers. If you've got somebody who's got greater tissue stress because of their mechanics, and we then just say well, actually, as soon as they hit this norm value, which is based on the wider population of people who might not have higher stresses because of the way that they run, you're now fine. I think that's a bit of a mistake there. So it's knowing that if the mechanics change your stress, maybe for you we have to have much greater single leg bridge endurance because you've got to cope with much greater work done throughout your running compared to another individual. And it's the same for lumbar-pelvic control, right? It's applying a perturbation to the pelvis. It's applying a perturbation to the hamstring as we run, as that pelvis rotates and rocks all over the place, and particularly lengthens the proximal attachment. So knowing that somebody does that from a conditioning perspective, if I'm not going to change those mechanics, I might think right, well, I've really got to be able to work that individual's ability to cope with these perturbations on the hamstring. I've really got to try and target the proximal aspect of the hamstring. And therefore, I'll design my conditioning strategies to do that. And for me, if I did that, one of the things that I'm very, very keen on is trying to make sure people develop this ability to disassociate movements between the pelvis and hip. And it's one mistake that I often see with athletes that I work with is they'll be like, okay, yeah, I used Roman chair, glute ham raises or deadlifts. And you watch them do the movement and they've just got masses of flexion through the lumbar spine and they don't really disassociate the pelvis and hip. And yet when they go to run, they've got huge rotation in terms of anterior pelvic tilt. So what's then happening is the conditioning strategy in the gym is not really preparing the proximal aspect of the hamstring to cope with that length change. And then they're going back out to the field and exposing themselves to that. So for me, straight away, I'm like, right, well, I'm going to focus a lot of my conditioning around now your ability to lengthen at that proximal aspect of the hamstring, disassociate the two, and really try and give us a big stimulus on that tissue, like what they're going to experience when they run. So that's just some of the ideas of how you can not even have to consider changing the movement patterns, just inform your conditioning strategies first of all. And then, if you want, you could, and I guess one of my opinions is there's two reasons why it's too simple if we make it really simple. Two simple reasons of why we'll get a strain injury. Either the tissue can't cope with the applied forces, or the applied forces and the applied strain is just excessive. So if you change sprint mechanics, you'll change the applied forces. So then that goes into like, right, well, maybe I should consider how I can change or influence the mechanics of the people that I'm working with. That's where people argue that, we can't necessarily make a change, but Jordan is showing in his work that yes, we can make a change, and there are other studies as well that have been published that show you can make a change on an acute level, so there and then. So yes, I believe you can. How we do it is what people often struggle with, and I think people struggle with it because it's messy, for one. It doesn't follow like this simple linear path. Like I have a really nice like linear framework of what I do, and I take people through in the journey, but which starts with developing physical qualities. But firstly, one point on that is to assume that a gym-based intervention is going to directly transfer to changing the movement pattern somebody adopts when they are out in the field is never going to happen. Like gym-based interventions or just simple strengthening exercises does not mean somebody will run or move differently. If we want to change movement, we have to target movement. Then to make it really simple, start with the end in mind. So if I want to influence movement with someone, I will start at the end and I'll move backwards. And by starting at the end, it's usually showing someone a video of, this is what you do. This is what I want you to look like. Try and figure that out. And we're going to do that with just simple runs, simple drills, simple cues. And see if they can figure it out themselves, first of all. Now, what happens is you've got to accept that you're trying to change a movement that they have perhaps adopted through learnt behaviors over a lot of years. So when you do make a change, if they're capable of it, it will probably be messy to begin with. They will overshoot, they will undershoot, the patterns will be completely unstable, they'll be all over the place. So they'd have to practice that time and time again to make those patterns become ingrained into like automatic processes and to become more stable. If somebody's really struggling with it, you can then go backwards and start to go, right, well, can I create a drill that breaks down this specific movement and challenges their ability to bring in the pattern I want to see into a more simple and more constrained task. So it might be things like wicket runs are great for doing that. Certain aspects of sprint running drills are also great for doing that, because they allow somebody in a more constrained environment to learn the movement you want, and then you can go back to applying it to that full task. So in some individuals it can be really challenging to do, but I've had some really nice cases where people will come to see me and it's almost like I've done absolutely nothing, and I love those days where I can go, look at this video. And they'll look at it and go, you tell me what you're doing wrong or what you think's going on. And they'll explain it and I'll go, yeah. And then the next question they always give me is, well, what do I do about that? And I go, well, you change it. And just watch to see if they can like internally figure it out. And I've had some great occasions where that is all that's needed and that works. And it's just brilliant because it's almost like I've not done anything for that individual and my input was not necessary. So it's great. So you can change people in that way. But if you don't want to change people, I get it. This is how you can use it to inform your rehabilitation strategies. When you are making a change, it is kind of that thing of like weighing up the risk reward of any type of individual. Is it risky for me to do this or is it not? My personal belief is if somebody runs in a way that I think is going to influence injury, I would perhaps want to make a change and try to make a change in their mechanics, but it's all contextual, right? So I'm not working with the people that you're working with. That is the contextual decision that you have to make, is whether or not the risk outweighs the reward when you're making a change there.
Fantastic. Incredible. Have a drink. Take a breath. Great stuff.
You asked me a big question.
And I love it. I love it. It's so much detail. So thank you very much. What's next for this project?
Well,
just get
there's
people
another
to get using
paper
it.
Well, one, I'd like people to use it, and I'd like the feedback from people using it, and hopefully trying to use it in those ways in terms of informing what to do from a conditioning perspective, or trying to change and evaluate mechanics. We do have a few clubs who already do use it, and those are the clubs that I'd worked with in the process of trying to develop it in the first place. We've got another paper which I'm trying to sort of finalise and get in publication, which looks at its association, or I'm not going to give you spoilers on that one, but it's basically looking at the score and injury. It's going to be the most unblinded peer review process in the world, because whoever's picking up has probably listened to this or come across the work before. But there's that, and there's some conversations that I've got ongoing with JB and Jordan for where we actually try and take these next steps, really.
Fantastic. And where you said it's open access. Where can people get it? Where can people find you on socials? Because I messaged you the other day that it absolutely blew up when you put it out there. So people, clearly the need and the interest is there. So I'm excited to see where it goes. So yeah, where can people get the paper? Where can people find you?
Okay, paper is open access on American Journal of Sports Medicine. So literally, if you just Google the sprint mechanics assessment score, it'll come up. You can probably also get it off my ResearchGate profile, I think. ResearchGate tends to automatically update itself. I don't really automatically update it, so don't expect me to reply to messages on there. I have no idea what's going on. In terms of if people want to reach out and ask me any questions, social media, I'm moderately active on Twitter or X and Instagram via the handle @Bramah. So I'm moderately active on there. You might get hold of me via email, c.a.bramah@salford.ac.uk. If you appear at the top of my inbox, I'll probably reply, or via text message or phone call. Even if you're family, I probably won't reply.
I like it. No, well, thank you so much for the last hour and 20 we've been talking, but just under an hour we've been recording. So excited to see where this goes. Thank you very much for such in-depth info on the on this new SMAS and all the things that go around it. So really appreciate it, and look forward to keeping in touch.
No, thanks for having me on, Rob. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Speak soon, mate.